Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today, we will be discussing about the arguments for a materialistic theory of mind. But before that, as we have been discussing about the arguments against materialism and arguing in favor of dualism, let us see how far these arguments sustain in philosophical discourses. These arguments, as you know, are advocated from the point of view of religion, from the point of view of introspection as one of the essential feature of mind, from the point of view of parapsychology. All these arguments are discussed in the last class. Now, today we will be talking about the difficulties in retaining these arguments, particularly when we talk about introspection as a kind of a mechanism to look into the inner experiences of the mind or the mental life of human beings or any other creatures. We find that it is very difficult to have this argument of from the point of view of introspection. Now, the question arises is here, does inner observation reveal things, reveal the reality? Because when we talk about sight, hearing, touch, etc., we say that let us talk about the excitation of the color of an apple. Now, the red surface of apple does not look like the matrix of molecules reflecting photons at a certain critical wavelengths. So, this is what is the language of science I was talking about. Now, materialism would talk about the existence of reality, the existence of the physical phenomena from the point of view of the scientific understanding of the reality, the scientific understanding of the physical phenomena. Now, when they would be explaining us what is color and how does a red apple look like. Now, if that is the question, then they would have a certain explanation like this, that now there are certain molecules which are reflecting photons at a certain critical wavelength. So, there is a electrochemical states in the neural network. So, the very sensation of having a color will refer to what kind of neural processes are involved, what kind of chemical secretions are happening, what kind of the electromagnetic waves are seen in the case of such an sensation of color or etc. So, introspection will not really refer to the existence of such things. Introspection will only talk about how do an individual feel like having that experience, whether it is an experience of pain, whether it is an experience of happiness, whether it is an experience of color. So, the language of science and the language of philosophy completely differs, in the sense that philosophical description does not strictly hold on to the language of science. Philosophy tries to explicate the reality which is embedded in the mental life. So, for example, that the very fact that I am very fascinated and being attracted towards this red object called apple is my personal feeling towards that object. I am expressing my personal feeling towards an object. So, that is undeniable. It is not that science is wrong. It is not that the kind of explanation science provides to us is completely meaningless. No, philosophers would not argue from that point of view. Philosopher would argue that let us accept science, let us accept the propositions of science, and also not to deny the fact that such a reality exists. The experiences are very unique kind of phenomenon, and that exist in reality, and particularly when we talk about the human mind. And therefore, the argument of irreducibility is again and again comes back to the discourse of philosophy of mind, whether mind can be completely explained by the scientific terms. Is the language of science is sufficient enough to talk about human mind? So there are some challenges, and there are some challengeable questions which are often advocated by philosophers of mind, who accept that there is something called mind, and maybe they are dualists, maybe some of them are idealists who would like to speak from the point of view of religion. I mean, idealists would probably talk about the reality, and this reality exists depending on the kind of perception that we have, and that will be a kind of a philosophical thesis which a subjective idealist would talk about. That is a dangerous thesis, in fact, because it is dangerous in the sense that a subjective idealist would say that my ideas are all only real. Reality that is dependent on my idea or constructed by my mind is only real. So, whatever I am representing is only real. So, that kind of assertions are not philosophically correct. So, philosophers would delve into the issues which are raised by science and scientific community, which pursue the research in this particular area called the mind or the mental. So, the argument of irreducibility is also being challenged. It is being challenged, let us say reason is not central to human thinking, because when we talk about mathematical reasoning are sometimes created. The very sophisticated robot will create solution to certain mathematical problems, probably which a kind of a naive mind will not able to comprehend the problems, may not be able to imagine that such an things can be solved, but computer can do that, and a very sophisticated artificially made robot can solve the problem. So, that is where we can imagine a case where mathematical reasoning is being created by, and it is created by human beings, of course, but it is created and being put in the machine, and machine can operate and demonstrate that machine is capable of solving the problem. So, that is what is important. It does not matter who is creating it, it matters how it is being solved. Now, the very fact that it is being solved by a particular robot in a particular way, or by following a kind of a multiple ways, is something very relevant to the philosophical community, the community who argues for the dualistic thesis of mind, because such a challenge can be very dangerous to the dualistic thesis, because reasoning is no more a kind of an essential property of human mind. Reasoning is rather can be artificially made. The very fact that reasoning is a kind of a faculty for articulating judgment, for articulating decisions, articulating actions, etc., is artificially or can be artificially made is something very significant to us. Now, therefore, a computational mechanism displays general principle of mathematical reasoning is something very significant. Now, let us talk about the argument from language. Now, language, as we mentioned earlier, that it is only a human phenomenon. Human beings do have language, in the sense that it is a full fledged sense in which human languages are capable of analyzing meaning. They are capable of communicating to the others, interpreting others' actions. Animals do produce sounds, animals do communicate among themselves, birds do make sounds. But what is important in the case of human sound making is a typical way in which humans produce sound. Human beings talk, human beings articulate their thoughts, they represent their thoughts. Now, this idea of representation and communication are central to human linguistic life. Human beings live a kind of a full fledged linguistic life, and from the point of view of that life, that forms of life, we are able to interpret others' form of life. So, for example, the form of life of animals, birds, insects, all their behaviors are interpreted from the kind of linguistic categories that we have with us in our form of life, that is the human form of life. So, is language an essential aspect which can explain human behavior completely? Probably yes, but what is important here is that is language intrinsic to life? Is language essentially embedded in life? Is being questioned by the philosophers who definitely like the dualistic theory of mind. They question that language can be artificially made, like reason is artificially formed. Similarly, we can form language in an artificial way, and as you know that computational mechanism that we are talking about is fully developed by developing a kind of an artificial language. Java, Photons, C++, all these things that you are learning are nothing but artificial language. So, an artificial language can also be made, and it can run in the machine and perform certain linguistic activities is something very significant to us, because if language can be artificially made, then we will have linguistic beings. Probably those beings are also artificial beings. So, there is nothing specific about human life per se, which will suggest that human beings are linguistic beings. Rather, there are other beings who have this and therefore, they are able to comprehend certain things. They have certain extraordinary power of comprehending and solving the problems. So, a being is empowered or can be empowered by by language, and this language can be artificially made. So, there is nothing and therefore, specific about language. So, it is only a matter of degree, it is only a matter of complexity that is involved here. So, language use can also be there in the case of physical systems. So, like robots have language, computer or computational processes are performed by using artificial language. Now, here is an argument which creates no problem for materialism or a materialistic theory of mind or a scientific theory of mind. So, that is what is the non-dualist would argue about. The non-dualist who are in fact non-idealist, in fact, they are realist, or you can say that they are physicalist, who say that matter only is real. Okay. So, we will have some discussion on materialism today, but what is important is to look at these arguments, the arguments from the point of view of introspection, argument against this irreducibility thesis, particularly with reference to reason and language. And then we will find that regarding the intrinsic qualities of sensations, that there is an active research programs which are going on in the scientific world is something very significant, and it is not just rhetoric. There is no rhetoric possible. Science does not speak its language as philosophers of course speak. So, there is no rhetoric involved in it. Rather, what is important for the scientific community who are involved in the research activities of mind, they are in fact interested to explain the mystery about the mind. That is what is interesting to them. Now, we would look at the notion of parapsychology, whether parapsychology is a valid theory at all. For example, parapsychology would have some kind of mystery in it. When we talk about telepathy, we do have the sense of a feeling that yes, my mother is remembering me, or this is what he must be thinking right now, and if you call him, you will find out yes, exactly he is thinking that. If parapsychology is a successful theory of mind, then how far it is scientific, in the sense that how far it is rational to be engaged in such kind of a discourse. Some philosophers of mind would also find that when we talk about telepathy, we will also find that there is some kind of a radiation, electromagnetic wave radiation happening at the speed of light. Now, that is very amazing evidences that we find in the case of scientific explanations. So, wave have effects, and when we say that somebody else is remembering me or thinking about me, probably his mind is acting like as a receiver, okay, or a transmitter, who is transmitting one mind transmitting thought, another mind trying to capture that wavelength, and so in that sense there is a kind of a connection established through this wavelength. So, the electromagnetic wavelength that happens when we start thinking means we are not a sleeping mind, we are actively engaged in thinking. So, that is what when we think and this wavelength is being created, the effect of this wavelength is also being felt. Okay. And what matters is probably the intensity of thinking. If the intensity of thinking is more, probably the wavelength is more, and the wavelength is effective. So, from that point of view, we cannot really deny the kind of wavelength, the electromagnetic wavelength that radiates, that cannot be deniable. There may be somebody who is thinking what I am thinking right now, that is possible, that is unobservable, but what is observable is that there is a magnetic wave being received by an individual. That is what is significant. You can call it telepathy or you can call it something else. So, science would in fact go with this kind of evidences, because science would try to prove things to us that yes, this is what is happening in the mind. This is what is happening in the mind when we are contemplating on telepathy. So, what we call telepathy, or what a religious person will talk about telepathy, or a parapsychologist will talk about telepathy, the neuroscientist would say that no, there is an electromagnetic wave radiation happening, and what matters most to us is the intensity of this wave, how it is being received by the other mind. The mind is not only creating the wave, the mind also acts as a receiver, and that is a kind of a significant evidence to explain that telepathy is not a mystery. Rather, if telepathy happens, then it happens in a more scientific way. So, with these few arguments, we would conclude that there are points of views which does not really strengthen the arguments that are put forward by the dualist. The dualistic conception of mind cannot hold on to the arguments of introspection, cannot hold on to the argument of language or reason, and cannot hold on to the evidences that are given by the parapsychologists or the religious people. So, the dualistic theory must come up with a new kind of language, new vocabulary, and a new theory that would strongly put forth their case. Okay. So, let us conclude that mind can be explained by science more significantly than whatever we understand from these arguments that are given by dualists. So, the scientific notion of mind is in fact would help us to locate what are the physical operations, what are the neural functions that are happening inside the brain, because we are almost sure in 21st century that it is the brain which controls all our voluntary actions. It is the brain which is responsible for our experiences, feelings, sensations, etc., etc. Now, if that is true, let us see how far the brain mind dichotomy is resolved. Now, from this I would like to discuss on materialism. Before talking about materialism, I would rather try to understand the arguments against dualism and conclude that materialist methodology is somehow very close to the scientific understanding of mind, and what matters for the materialistic theory of mind is the physical existence of the matter and the properties that this material bodies have. So, and how simply these properties can be explained. So, simplicity is retained, okay, and the arguments ought to be simple, as Occam Schreger tells us that in order to explain mind, we need not exaggerate the mind. Probably the kind of argument which Churchland is mentioning is something try to exaggerate the notion of mind. The kind of theorization which, if these arguments are valid, the kind of theorization that is made is more complex. So, what is important for us and what we can achieve here is this, that if we adhere to the argument of simplicity, okay, and science particularly aims at this notion of simplicity, that it tries to clarify things, it tries to clarify the more complex phenomenon and try to show us that yes, this is how things can be explained, and these are with reference to some evidences. So, that is what is very significant about the scientific understanding of mind. So, the explanatory devices that are available to us is particularly with reference to the materialistic theory of mind, we will talk about the neuroscience, and that fulfills the demand of simplicity. So, the existing microstructure and the causal relationship that the brain mechanism holds with the bodily organism is something very significant. So, and that is true when we talk about pain and pain behavior and the eradication of pain. So, the entire brain processes, the entire neurological processes in the brain not only control our behavior, but also are fairly responsible for making voluntary actions, and that is what the materialistic theory of mind would talk about. So, the brain is the center of all this, the materialistic theory. So, what you really talk about is, say, in the case of a trauma or traumatic experiences, or in the case of any other experiences, how do we recognize that experience? That is important. Now, recognition through neural devices, linguistic ability and learning. Now, all these are important factors. How do we learn things? Okay, what is the mechanism of learning, and how do we express those ideas? These are the things which are very important for us. And so, physical, chemical and electrical properties are necessary to formulate physical laws. It is through the law we can explain the behaviors, we can predict the behaviors of human beings. So, laws are important in scientific world. So, it is with the help of law we explain things. So, explanation of mind depends on how the laws are formulated and how these laws, let us talk about mental laws, perform their activities. So, that is important. So, laws are based on evidences, facts, okay. And it is through those observable facts of those properties, physical, chemical and electrical properties of the brain will give us, or in fact will explain what is the notion of mind we have. Now, with this understanding of the notion of mind, let us go back to the kind of argument which were advocated by Gilbert Ryle. Now, I mentioned that Gilbert Ryle is giving a kind of a behavioristic interpretation of the mind. Now, there are various schools of materialism. Behaviorism is one of them. The question that is put to us is this: is Ryle a behaviorist? Now, what is behaviorism? Behaviorism tells us that there is nothing called mind, rather mind can be known with the help of behaviors. It is as simple as this. Behaviors are observable phenomena, and by observing these behaviors, the patterns in which a particular individual behave, or a particular group behave, or a particular community behaves, we can formulate certain laws. And with the help of laws, as I said earlier, we can explain their mind, we can predict their mind, etc. Now, when Ryle says that Descartes' concept of mind is like a ghost in the machine, when Ryle says that Descartes is committing a kind of a mistake which can be called category mistake, because mind and body are not categorically two independent entities, rather what is significant and available to our observation is our behaviors. How does an individual behave in the world, or how does an individual behave when he is interacting with the world. So, behaviors are significant. and behaviors, if behaviors are taken into account, then it will deny that there is something called a hidden mind that controls all our voluntary actions and behaviors. So, Ryle is in fact denying that, but is Ryle a behaviorist the way probably W. B. Watson, P. F. Skinner conceptualized the notion of behaviorism as an experimental science. Now, today let us briefly look at what is the Rylean behaviorism all about. What are the philosophical presuppositions behaviorists maintain when they advocate this thesis that behaviors reveal the mind. So, let us look at this. There is one point which is very clear to us: behaviorism deny dualism. So, philosophical behaviorism or logical behaviorism, which Ryle is advocating, certainly against this idea that mind is a substance. Ryle rejects this thesis that mind is a substance, and what is important for Ryle is that how an individual interact with the world. Philosophical behaviorism claims that any sentence about the mental state can be paraphrased without loss of meaning. Let us understand this concept of meaning now into a long and complex sentence about what observable behaviors would result if the person in question were in this, that or the other observable circumstances. This is how Churchland would describe the concept of philosophical behaviorism. This is with reference to Churchland's book, as I mentioned. The title of the book is Matter and Consciousness, published in 1984, and the revised edition came out in 1988. Please refer to this text. This gives a contemporary introduction to the philosophy of mind, the problems about the philosophy of mind, and Churchland finds that behaviorism, philosophical behaviorism is a problem. Philosophical behaviorism is also argued or advocated by Putnam, Hilary Putnam, in his essay The Brain and the Behavior. So, I would like to talk about particularly what is the philosophical presuppositions, what is the background on which philosophical behaviorism or logical behaviorism is argued. Now, as I mentioned that they are talking about the meaning of the concept of mind. What does mind really mean to us? Is this meaning observable? Does the meaning, the kind of terms, the vocabularies that are used, the expressions that are used will designate to something observable is a question, and particularly this has been argued under the influence of logical positivism. So, Ryle or the Ryleans who reject the dualistic thesis of mind, they were under the influence of logical positivists. Now, according to logical positivists, what is real is observable, what is meaningful is observable. If something is meaningful, if an expression is meaningful, then it must exist in reality. So, the verificationist notion of meaning, as it has been argued by some of the logical positivists, particularly as Ayer, Rudolf Carnap, Notis Leak, and early Wittgenstein to some extent, has been the logical positivists. They hold on to the thesis that observable phenomena are only real, and the kind of language which philosophers speak or the way philosophers theorize things, whether it is about the mind or anything else, it must correspond to the reality. And when they say this, they say that philosophical problems arise because there is some kind of a linguistic and conceptual confusion, and once this conceptual confusion are dissolved through analysis, then the problem is resolved. So, a philosophical problem arises because of the use of language, the vocabulary, as Searle points out, as Ryle also points out. Descartes' dualism is problematic because the kind of vocabulary that is used by Descartes. So, all the time they are referring to language. So, philosophical problems are problems of language, the kind of language that has been used to theorize mind. So, logical positivists, as you all know, reject metaphysics. According to them, metaphysical problems are pseudo problems. Metaphysical problems are not found. Idealists like Hegel would say that absolute is real, and whatever is real is rational. So, the absolute can be rationally comprehended, the absolute can be rationally grasped. Now, you do not have this notion of absolute there as a fact. Hegel's idealism will talk about the realization of the absolute through a dialectical process, and that is something to do with experience, and experience is something internal. So, logical positivist on the other hand would talk about the existence of reality corresponding to an external facts, because that which is external can be observable and can be demonstrated. So, logical positivists were very much influenced by the methodology of science. As you know, science go with this idea of observation and experiment, and there are many more, but these two concepts are very basic to scientific understanding. Not only conceptualize or create hypothesis, but also they try to prove the hypothesis. Now, the proof of the hypothesis lies there in the observation of facts. So, corresponding to the hypothesis, there must be certain facts in the world, in the reality, and these observable facts are to be further experimented, following a kind of a methodology, and then we can suggest that yes, or we can form laws and explain things. So, scientific suggestions are always for the explanation of particular facts, and they are always about demonstration, that which can be demonstrated and observed from the third person's point of view. They are not about the internal experiences. So, scientists are mostly externalists. Now, the scientific explanations are always demonstrated. We can prove our scientific thesis by producing instances, by producing facts which are observable and verifiable. So, logical positivists were influenced by this idea of verification and observation. Now, the verificationist principle suggests that if a statement is said or is articulated in a particular philosophical theory, then this statement must have meaning corresponding to the facts that are there in the world. So, there is some kind of a correspondence theory of truth advocated by the logical positivist. If it does not correspond to a fact, then it is meaningless, it is nonsensical. So, it is not that there will be always a kind of a one-to-one correspondence, rather a kind of a a set